Mr. Schindler, hello. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, you are actually in New York, but you have worked a lot in Germany and in Europe. Would you say that Europe is working well against counterterrorism?
Look, I mean, clearly the counterterrorism strategies have got more nuanced. They've got more integrated within the system, but it's still conceptually not meeting the demands of the times. We've talked at this conference very much about October 7th as a terror attack. But this conflict is only one of a whole host of conflicts that surround the European Union, that pump extremism and violence into Europe. So we have, of course, the big war in Ukraine. We have the Middle East conflict, not only with Hamas and Hezbollah, but also now in the Gulf region. We have a resurgence of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Afghanistan, and we have a complete destabilization between the Atlantic and the Pacific in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have the largest growth area of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State worldwide. So Europe is at the moment not devoid of conflict zones and terrorist threats. Given this situation and given the unprecedented spike in anti-Semitism that we've seen since October 7th, which continues despite now there being a ceasefire in Gaza for a long time, we need to add to the approach that we have been doing for the last 2 decades, which is essentially a bottom-up approach, where we look at the individual terrorist act, we look at the individual terrorist cell or the terrorist perpetrator, and of course, try to find them, to arrest them, to prosecute them. This is the criminal law approach that any government in a democratic society has to. But this needs to be augmented by an understanding that this level of extremism, as well as extremism violence in Europe, including anti-Semitic violence, can no longer be explained just by individuals doing individual things. You have to also focus on the underlying networks, their functionality, their connections, and very, very important, the money that makes these networks run.
Mr. Schindler, we've talked about Europe. Most of the time, Europe is divided. On every question, Europe is divided. But
I would say Europe is diverse.
Yeah, not only that, but okay. Was it a surprise for you that Europe was so much divided during this war against Iran?
To be totally honest, there was a good argument why dealing with the Iranian regime and in particular its nuclear dossier by military means would be a very risky, very costly endeavor. And it was not just European governments, it was subsequent several US administrations who exactly came to the same conclusion. So had the current US administration in Israel asked the Europeans, they would have certainly advised not to do this. However, this does not cover up the fact that this war is now actually happening. It's a reality. And it really is a little bit surprising to me that many governments in the European Union seem to have a problem to see where our European or each individual national security interests lie. And once now that war has started, and it is clearly also geared towards destabilizing the regime in the hope that the opposition can challenge the regime and a more moderate political structure in Iran is arise, it cannot be in this situation a European or any national interest inside the European Union that this regime survives.
Many were not really concerned, were saying that this war is not a war concerning Europe. Do you agree?
I always argue it is definitely not our war. No one asked the Europeans, no one consulted the Europeans, but it's 100% still our problem. And it's even more our problem than, with the exception of Israel, than it is in America. All the negative side effects of a weakened but surviving regime in Iran will hit Europe first, long before it affects the US mainland, US economy. So what would happen if this regime survives? It will be weak. That means it has to reestablish its control inside the country. And within the region. How is it going to do that? Inside the country, the regime has already said as soon as this war is over, we are going, and has said so publicly on the public TV channels inside Iran. Once this war is over, we're going to take revenge against all those who were disloyal in the country or any Iranian outside the country who helped the enemy. That means it will be unleashing an orgy of violence against anyone in the country that was critical of the regime, simply to re-establish its power because it's weak. In addition, it will have to be extremely aggressive in its dealing with the Gulf region, and that also includes its management of the Strait of Hormuz, which means the regime was always a factor of instability in the Gulf. It will be more so because it's weak. And it will use the Strait of Hormuz as the trigger point for whatever it wants to achieve with Europe, with any regional stake. It will be a permanent problem to have the export of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz going forward. That affects you. And thirdly, the regime will, of course, try to rebuild its drone program. It will try to rebuild its rocket program. And with extreme likelihood, it will try to rebuild its nuclear program, but with an aim to get a bomb as quickly as possible, which is, again, first, an Israeli problem, and second, a European problem. It takes a long time before it becomes an American problem. So it is our problem, this conflict.
And talking about the nuclear problem and even the missile problem, it's not a new problem. Everyone knew that Iran was doing that, even with the JCPOA before, which was, like most of people think, not a good thing. How can you explain that people let Iran continue those programs during all those years?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would characterize the JCPOA both as a success and as a failure. So if you look at what the JCPOA, the actual text of the JCPOA, what it said, what it wanted to achieve, what the idea was to achieve, it did achieve that. Right? It did limit the amount of nuclear material Iran had, the number of centrifuges that Iran had, very effectively and verifiably, number one. Number two, it did limit the range of Iranian ballistic missiles, because what is often forgotten, there is a small passage in the JCPOA that talks about long-range ballistic missiles of Iranians as continuing to be part of the United Nations Security Council sanctions regime. So that's what it achieved. What it did not achieve is what the hope was of the JCPOA and why the JCPOA was at the same time a failure. The hope of the JCPOA from the European and at the time from the Obama administration was that you have 15 years of reduced sanctions pressure on the country, which would enable us to re-engage with the regime and the country economically, which will hopefully lead to a better economic and political situation, which would then enable both sides to talk about the more thorny issues, the relationship of Iran to this proxy network of terror organizations, from Hamas to Hezbollah to the Houthis to the Iraqi militias, the drone and in particular the mid-range ballistic missile program that Iran built up because it is isolated in the region. This did not materialize. In fact, the money that the Iranian regime got because of the sanctions relief that the Europeans primarily did as part of the JCPOA was not invested in actual economic projects. It was invested very heavily in pushing forward in developing its rocket program. So what the JCPOA, as the contract was concerned, right, between the two sides, was supposed to achieve, it did. What was hoped to achieve with the JCPOA, it absolutely did not. In fact, it actually achieved the opposite. So one could make both arguments. It was a failure, but it could also make an argument that wasn't a success.
As my last question, I would like to have your opinion about the narrative that is actually going on this war, and particularly about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Like when you hear European media, they keep saying that Donald Trump didn't think about what happened in Hormuz. Donald Trump was not prepared to this war. Donald Trump didn't think so much about what's happening. What do you feel?
Look, there's hardly a scenario worldwide that was more planned and more war-gamed than an attack against Iran by the Europeans, by the Americans, by the Israelis, the Europeans, and the Americans. So none of what happened in the last 5 weeks by now was in any way surprising. The Iranians had announced in 2005 that they redone their military doctrine into this so-called mosaic defense, which means it decentralized your command and control structure. The Iranians have long said that if they get militarily attacked, they will disrupt the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians had threatened the civilian infrastructure in the region if they case the attack. So none of this was surprising. The military campaign, the conventional military campaign of Israel and the United States went maximum success. Right? You had 13,000 attacks on Iran. One airplane was shut down by the Iranians. Right? So it could not have gone better. The problem was the second half of the war games, the answer to the predictable hybrid warfare response of the regime against a conventional military attack. That part was not implemented by the US or the Israelis until very recently. So the closure of the Strait of Hormuz should not have happened a couple of days ago, but the first day the Iranians disrupted the Strait of Hormuz, to make very clear to the regime that while their disruption of the Strait of Hormuz creates a significant problem for the world economy, the Strait of Hormuz is actually their Achilles heel as far as finance is concerned. While there is 20% of oil that the world consumes going through the Strait of Hormuz, 100% of Iranian oil and 100% of Iranian gas and petrochemical products that Iran exports goes to the Strait.
So you're convinced that Iran will go back to the table of negotiation because of that?
That is, if the blockade can be maintained and the escalation be avoided, i.e. that it doesn't deteriorate again into a mutual shooting game, the Iranian regime will have no choice but to come back to the negotiation table, because within a week, 2 weeks, they're going to have significant financial problems inside Tehran, because there is, when you do not sell your oil, there's also no money flowing back, i.e. you have no longer any income stream. So the regime will have no choice. And the regime, and this is really important to understand, from its generation, if you look at the book of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the guy who came up with the idea of the Islamic Republic and who wrote the book on the Velayat al-Faqih, right, the supreme religious leader, and how such a political system was supposed to be established. In that book, he says, if it's necessary for the survival of the regime to destroy a mosque, to build a road, you destroy the mosque. The survival of the regime is the most important thing.
So they are ready to everything.
The regime is absolutely willing to compromise when it feels it is significantly threatened. There's another really actually quite interesting concrete point in time where the regime, or 2 points in time, right? Khomeini accepts the ceasefire with the Iraq, right? The famous "I drink from the poison chalice." That was because he felt the regime was at mortal danger. And in 2003, after the fall of the regime of Saddam Hussein, the then president of Iran, Khatami, writes a letter to the American administration in which he says, we can discuss the nuclear issue. We don't really need our proxies really anymore. We do our relationship. It was so conciliatory that George W. Bush administration did not believe that this was a letter that the regime was sending. They thought it was just President Khatami, right, and did not have the backing of the regime. But that shows you that the regime, when it comes to the push and shove, is willing and able to compromise. The problem with the compromise is, of course, we are now then essentially abandoning the Iranian people. If we are compromising with this regime before it destabilizes, then the Iranian people will have to continue to live for that regime, and the best chance for the Iranian people to get rid of this regime in 47 years is gone. And it will take a very long time before that chance comes. That's the price you have to pay for the end of the war with the regime intact. But the regime will make an offer. I'm very certain of that. That will be far more conciliatory.
Don't accept it.
The problem is, there is, apart from the economic timeline, which is a little bit variable, there is a very, very hard political timeline in which both the Israeli administration as well as the US administration will have to end this conflict. And that's the elections in Israel, which will happen at the end of October, and the elections in the US, the midterm elections, which will happen in November. They cannot have a conflict of this magnitude. Neither one of the governments can have a conflict of this magnitude.
No,
going
the
on with
populations.
right? So it will have to end somewhere in late
Summer.
summer at the very latest. July, maybe August, very, very, very at the latest. If at that point the regime still stands and the jury is still out, it's likely that it still does, then that's it, right? Chance forward. Because then both governments will have to go into the election campaign, and neither Donald Trump nor Prime Minister Netanyahu is super eager to lose those elections. Donald Trump, because he doesn't like to lose elections, we know that. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, because if he does lose the elections, he has a string of court appointments, none of which are going to go well for him. So he has a personal interest to it. So that's where the timeline that cannot be moved. That's the absolute endpoint, and the regime knows. So both the American as well as the Israeli governments need to be very careful that the Iranian side understands that this is the timeline, that they don't get strung along with these negotiations until the deadline has arrived.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schindler.